The sun was setting over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Inside the old community center on Main Street, Margaret Sullivan pushed her cleaning cart down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. She had been doing this job for nearly 15 years now, and she knew every corner of this building like the back of her hand. Margaret was the kind of person you'd pass on the street without a second glance. At 43 years old, she wore the same 3 cotton dresses throughout the week, rotating them carefully to make them last. Her brown hair was always pulled back in a simple bun, and her hands showed the wear of years spent scrubbing floors and polishing furniture. She wasn't anyone special, at least that's what everyone in town thought. Just the cleaning lady who came in early and left late. Tonight was different, though. The community center was hosting its biggest event of the year, the annual charity gala. Margaret had arrived at 5 in the morning to help prepare the main hall. For hours, she had worked alongside the event organizers, moving tables, arranging flowers, and making sure every glass sparkled under the chandelier lights. The transformation was remarkable. The usually plain hall now looked like something from a magazine, with white tablecloths, golden centerpieces, and soft lighting that made everything glow. By 7 in the evening, Margaret was exhausted. Her back ached from bending over tables and her feet hurt from standing all day. She had planned to slip out through the back entrance before the guests arrived, change out of her work clothes at home, and spend the evening with a cup of tea and a library book. That was her usual Saturday night, and she was comfortable with that rhythm. But as she gathered her things from the storage closet, she heard the first cars pulling into the parking lot. Through the small window, she could see them arriving. Expensive sedans and luxury vehicles, each one probably worth more than she'd earned in 5 years. Women stepped out wearing glittering dresses and high heels, their jewelry catching the light. Men in tailored suits held the doors open, laughing and chatting as they made their way inside. Margaret recognized most of them. There was Dr. Patterson, who owned the largest medical practice in 3 counties. The Henderson family, who ran the successful chain of supermarkets. And of course, Catherine Whitmore, the mayor's wife, stepping out of a black Mercedes wearing a dress that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. She tried to make herself smaller, pressing against the wall as the first group entered the lobby. Margaret had learned long ago how to be invisible. It was a survival skill she'd perfected over the years. When you clean houses and offices and public spaces, you learn to move through rooms without being noticed, to avoid eye contact, to never interrupt conversations. It was easier that way, less awkward for everyone. But tonight something went wrong with her plan. Just as she was about to duck into the back hallway, she heard her name called out. Not quietly, but loud enough that several people turned to look. Margaret. Oh, Margaret, where are you going? It was Catherine Whitmore. Margaret's stomach sank. She knew Catherine, of course. Everyone in Millbrook knew the mayor's wife. But knowing someone and being noticed by them were 2 very different things. Catherine had a reputation around town. Some called her a social butterfly. Others, in quieter conversations, used less kind words. She was the type of woman who organized charity events not because she cared about helping people, but because she enjoyed being the center of attention. Margaret turned slowly, forcing a polite smile onto her face. Good evening, Mrs. Whitmore. I was just heading home. Everything's ready for your event. Catherine walked toward her, a champagne glass already in her hand even though the event had barely started. Her heels clicked against the polished floor that Margaret had spent an hour cleaning that morning. 3 other women followed behind Catherine, all dressed in expensive clothes, all wearing the same practiced smile that wealthy people use when they're pretending to be interested in someone beneath their social status. Heading home, but the evening's just beginning. Catherine's voice had that sugary quality that made Margaret's skin prickle. Something about the tone wasn't right. There was an edge underneath the sweetness, like a knife wrapped in velvet. I really should go. Mrs. Whitmore, I've been here since early morning, and I'm quite tired. Margaret tried to keep her voice steady and polite. She'd dealt with difficult people before. The key was to stay calm, be respectful, and extract yourself from the situation as quickly as possible. But Catherine wasn't letting her go that easily. She reached out and touched Margaret's arm, her fingers light but insistent. Oh, but we need your help with something. You know this building better than anyone, don't you? Margaret nodded cautiously. More guests were arriving now, filling the lobby. She could feel their eyes on her. This cleaning woman in her plain dress standing among people in designer clothes. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the walls like she usually did. "We've been having such trouble with the piano," Catherine continued, gesturing toward the main hall where an old upright piano sat in the corner. "It's dreadfully out of tune and some of the keys stick. We were supposed to have a pianist perform tonight, but she took one look at it and refused to play. Said it was unplayable." Margaret knew that piano well. It had been damaged last month when part of the roof leaked during a heavy storm. Water had gotten into the mechanism, warping some of the wood and affecting the tuning. The center had been planning to get it repaired, but these things took time and money, neither of which the community center had in abundance. "I'm sorry about that, Mrs. Whitmore, but I don't know anything about repairing pianos," Margaret said, trying once more to excuse herself. Catherine's smile widened, and that's when Margaret knew something bad was coming. She'd seen that smile before on the faces of bullies in school, on the faces of cruel bosses and difficult customers. It was the smile of someone about to enjoy themselves at another person's expense. "Oh, I don't need you to repair it," Catherine said, her voice getting louder. More people were stopping to watch now, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. "I thought, since you're always here in this building, perhaps you might know how to play it. Even a broken piano can make some sort of music, can't it?" The lobby had gone quieter. Conversations were trailing off as people turned to see what was happening. Margaret felt her face growing hot. She understood now. This wasn't about the piano at all. This was entertainment for Catherine and her friends. A little joke to amuse themselves before dinner was served. "I don't play piano, Mrs. Whitmore," Margaret said quietly, looking down at her worn shoes. "Oh, come now. Don't be modest." Catherine's grip on her arm tightened slightly. "It's for charity, after all. And who knows? Maybe you have hidden talents we don't know about." The women with Catherine giggled, and Margaret heard someone in the growing crowd chuckle. Her heart was pounding now, that familiar feeling of humiliation washing over her. She wanted to pull away, to run out the back door and never come back. But she also knew that refusing would only make things worse. Catherine Whitmore wasn't the type of woman who liked being told no, especially not in front of an audience. "Please, Mrs. Whitmore." "I really can't," Margaret tried one last time, her voice barely above a whisper. But Catherine was already leading her toward the main hall, her hand firmly on Margaret's elbow, her voice bright and cheerful as she announced to everyone, "Come see, our wonderful Margaret is going to attempt the impossible. She's going to play our broken piano." As they walked through the double doors into the main hall, Margaret felt dozens of eyes following them. The room fell silent, all attention now focused on the cleaning woman being led to the piano like a lamb to slaughter. And in that moment, standing there in her simple dress with her work-worn hands, Margaret had never felt smaller or more alone in her entire life. The walk from the lobby to the piano felt like the longest journey of Margaret's life. Every step echoed in the suddenly quiet hall. She could feel at least 60 pairs of eyes watching her, tracking her movement across the polished floor. Some people looked curious, others amused, and a few seemed uncomfortable, as if they knew this wasn't right but weren't willing to speak up and stop it. Catherine Whitmore kept her hand on Margaret's arm the whole way, guiding her with that false cheerfulness that made everything worse. Her friends followed close behind, whispering to each other and giggling. Margaret caught fragments of their conversation, words like, "This should be good," and "Poor thing doesn't know what she's gotten into." The piano sat in the corner like an old forgotten friend. Margaret had dusted it hundreds of times over the years, running her cloth over its scratched wooden surface, carefully cleaning between the keys. It was an upright model, probably 70 or 80 years old, with yellowed ivory keys and brass pedals that had lost their shine decades ago. The water damage from last month's leak had left visible stains on the wood, and she knew some of the internal hammers were probably warped. When they reached the piano bench, Catherine finally let go of her arm. "There you are, Margaret. Your stage awaits." She stepped back and started clapping, encouraging others to join in. The applause was mocking, the kind that makes your skin crawl because you know it's not meant to celebrate you but to ridicule you. Margaret stood there, frozen. The bench was just a few inches away, but sitting down felt impossible. Her legs wouldn't move. She glanced back at the crowd that had formed. More people were entering the hall now, drawn by the commotion. A man in an expensive suit was whispering something to his wife. A group of younger women, probably in their 20s, had their phones out, ready to record whatever was about to happen. Go ahead. Don't be shy, Catherine urged, her voice dripping with fake encouragement. We're all waiting. Margaret's hands were trembling. She clasped them together, trying to steady herself. In her 43 years of life, she had faced many difficult moments, but this felt particularly cruel. It wasn't just the humiliation of being put on display. It was the casual way Catherine had decided to use her as entertainment, as if Margaret's feelings didn't matter at all, as if she was just a toy to be played with and discarded. She thought about walking away, just turning around and pushing through the crowd and leaving this place forever. She could find another job, maybe in the next town over, but then what? Run away every time someone treated her poorly? She'd been running for so long already, hiding from her past, hiding from her pain, hiding from who she used to be. Slowly, with legs that felt like they were made of lead, Margaret sat down on the bench. The wood creaked under her weight. She stared at the keys, those familiar black and whites that she'd cleaned so many times without ever pressing them. The piano bench was lower than she remembered, or maybe she had just gotten used to standing while looking at it. Behind her, someone coughed. Another person laughed quietly. The room buzzed with anticipation, the kind of energy that comes before something embarrassing is about to happen. They were all waiting for her to fail, to prove what they already believed, that she was just a cleaning woman who didn't belong in their world. Margaret lifted her hands and placed them gently on the keys. The ivory was cool against her fingertips, smooth in some places and slightly rough in others where age had worn away the surface. She pressed down a middle C. The note came out flat and weak, the hammer inside struggling against the warped wood. She tried the key next to it. That one stuck completely, refusing to return to its original position. A few people in the crowd snickered. Catherine said something to the woman next to her, and they both smiled knowingly. Margaret could feel tears starting to form in her eyes. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of. Public humiliation, being laughed at, being reminded of her place in the world. She tried a few more keys, testing them randomly. Some worked, some didn't. The piano was indeed broken, just as Catherine had said. Playing anything coherent on it would be nearly impossible. Even someone with skill would struggle. And she was just supposed to be a cleaning woman who knew nothing about music. But that wasn't true, was it? That was the lie she'd been living for 30 years. The lie she'd told herself so many times that it had almost become real. Margaret closed her eyes and let herself remember. Really remember, for the first time in decades, she was 13 years old again, sitting in her parents' small apartment in the city. They'd saved for 2 years to buy her a used piano, sacrificing vacations and new clothes and nights out at restaurants. Her mother worked double shifts at the hospital. Her father took on weekend construction jobs. Also, their daughter could have an instrument to practice on. She remembered her first piano teacher, Mrs. Chen, a stern woman who demanded perfection, but who also saw something special in her young student. The hours of practice, her fingers moving faster and faster, scales and arpeggios until they became second nature. The first time she played a complete piece without mistakes, Beethoven's Für Elise, and how her mother had cried with pride. She remembered the audition for Juilliard, how nervous she'd been, how her hands had shaken just like they were shaking now, but once she'd started playing, the fear had melted away. There had been only the music, pure and clear, flowing through her like water through a stream. And when she'd finished, the panel of judges had looked at each other, and she'd known even before they spoke that she'd gotten in. 3 years at Juilliard. The best 3 years of her life. She'd been Margaret Chen back then, a prodigy, a young woman destined for concert halls and recordings and critical acclaim. Her professors had said she had something rare, not just technical skill but soul. When she played, she didn't just hit the right notes. She made the piano sing. She made it tell stories. She made people cry and laugh and remember things they'd forgotten. Then everything had fallen apart. Her parents' car accident, sudden, violent, final. She was 21 years old in her senior year, preparing for her final recital. One phone call and her entire world collapsed. No life insurance, medical bills from the hospital, student loans she couldn't pay, funeral costs, and beneath it all, grief so heavy it felt like drowning. She'd tried to keep going, tried to finish school, but her hands wouldn't cooperate anymore. Every time she sat at a piano, all she could think about was her parents, about how they'd sacrificed everything for her music, and now they'd never see her perform. The piano became a reminder of everything she'd lost. She dropped out 3 months before graduation. The years after that were a blur, moving from city to city, taking whatever jobs she could find, cleaning houses, waiting tables, working in factories. Each year she moved further away from who she'd been. Eventually she ended up in Millbrook, in this small town where nobody knew her past, where she could be invisible, where she could forget. Except she hadn't forgotten, not really. The music was still there, locked away inside her like a prisoner in a cell. Every time she walked past this piano, every time she dusted its keys, she felt it stirring. The melodies she used to play, the pieces she'd memorized, the feeling of her fingers flying across the keyboard. Margaret opened her eyes. The crowd was getting restless. Someone in the back said, "Is she going to play or what?" Catherine Whitmore had her arms crossed, a satisfied smirk on her face, clearly enjoying Margaret's discomfort. Something shifted inside Margaret. A door she'd kept locked for 30 years suddenly swung open. She looked at the broken piano, at its damaged keys and water-stained wood, and she saw herself reflected in it. Broken, forgotten, dismissed as useless. But broken things could still make music, couldn't they? Her hands were still trembling, but now it wasn't from fear. It was from something else entirely. Something that had been sleeping for 3 decades was waking up, stretching, remembering what it could do. Margaret took a deep breath and positioned her hands properly over the keys, her posture shifting, her shoulders relaxing. In the crowd, an older gentleman near the front noticed the change. He was Dr. Patterson, and he'd been a classical music enthusiast his whole life. He saw the way Margaret held her hands, the curve of her fingers, the professional positioning. His eyebrows went up slightly. That wasn't the posture of someone who didn't know how to play. Margaret's fingers touched the keys again, but this time with purpose. This time with intention. And in that moment, before she played a single note, everything in the room changed. The mocking energy shifted to curiosity. Even Catherine Whitmore stopped smiling, sensing that something unexpected was about to happen. Margaret thought about Chopin, her favorite composer. She thought about the nocturne in E-flat major, the piece she'd played for her parents the night before they died, the last time they'd heard her perform, and she decided that if she was going to break her 30-year silence, if she was going to open that locked door and let the music out, she would do it for them. Her fingers pressed down, and the first notes emerged from the broken piano. The first note hung in the air like a question mark. It was slightly flat, just as Margaret had expected from the damaged piano. But her fingers had already adjusted, already compensated. The second note followed, then the third, and suddenly the opening melody of Chopin's nocturne in E-flat major began to fill the room. For the first few seconds, the crowd didn't understand what they were hearing. It sounded nice enough, pleasant even, but nothing spectacular. A few people started whispering again, probably commenting on how the cleaning lady could play a little bit. Catherine Whitmore still had that smug expression on her face, clearly thinking this was going about as she'd expected. But then something changed. Margaret's hands began to move faster, more confidently. Her left hand established a gentle rhythm, while her right hand began to sing out the melody. The broken keys that had stuck moments ago suddenly seemed to cooperate, as if the piano itself recognized the touch of someone who understood it. Where notes were flat, Margaret adjusted her touch to make them sound intentional. Where keys stuck, she incorporated the hesitation into the music, turning flaws into artistic choices. The whispers in the crowd died down. People who had been standing near the back began moving closer. The older gentleman, Dr. Patterson, leaned forward in his chair, his eyes widening. He knew this piece. More importantly, he knew how difficult it was to play well, and he was hearing something extraordinary. Margaret's eyes were closed now. Tears had started rolling down her cheeks, but she didn't stop playing. In her mind, she wasn't in the community center anymore. She was back in her childhood apartment, playing for her parents on a Sunday afternoon. Her mother was sitting on the old sofa, still wearing her nurse's uniform from the morning shift, her eyes closed and a peaceful smile on her face. Her father was by the window, looking out at the city but listening to every note, his head nodding slightly with the rhythm. The music swelled and fell, breathing like a living thing. Margaret's fingers danced across the keys with a speed and precision that seemed impossible. She played passages that required both hands to cross over each other, her movements fluid and natural despite not having done this in 30 years. It was like riding a bicycle, except infinitely more complex. The muscle memory was still there, buried deep but not forgotten. Someone in the crowd gasped audibly. It was one of the younger women who'd been holding her phone. She'd started recording as a joke, expecting to capture something embarrassing to share with her friends later. Instead, her hands were shaking so much she almost dropped the device. What she was recording was something completely different, something beautiful and heartbreaking and real. Catherine Whitmore's smile had vanished entirely. Her face had gone pale and she stood frozen in place, champagne glass forgotten in her hand. The women who'd been giggling with her earlier now looked uncomfortable, guilty even. They were beginning to understand that they'd made a terrible mistake. This wasn't a cleaning lady fumbling through a broken piano. This was something else entirely. Margaret transitioned seamlessly from Chopin to Rachmaninoff, her fingers finding the opening notes of Prelude in C-sharp minor without conscious thought. This was a darker piece, more intense, and it demanded everything from both the player and the instrument. The broken piano groaned and sang under her hands, producing sounds it probably hadn't made in decades. The music filled every corner of the hall. It bounced off the walls, wrapped around the crystal chandeliers, and settled into the hearts of everyone listening. Some people had tears in their eyes. Others stood with their mouths slightly open, unable to process what they were witnessing. A few had pulled out their phones and were recording, but quietly now, reverently, as if they were documenting something sacred. Dr. Patterson moved closer to the piano, studying Margaret's face, her hands, the way her whole body moved with the music. He'd been to concerts at Carnegie Hall. He'd heard famous pianists perform in Vienna and Paris. And what he was hearing now was on that level. Maybe even beyond it, because there was something raw and powerful in this performance. Something that came from years of silence and suppressed pain finally being released. Margaret's hands flew across the keyboard, her fingers moving so fast they were almost a blur. She was playing passages that would challenge even professional concert pianists, and she was doing it on an instrument that most musicians had declared unplayable. But she wasn't fighting the piano's limitations. She was working with them, using them, making them part of the performance. A string inside the piano snapped with a sharp twang. Most people flinched at the sound, but Margaret didn't miss a beat. She simply adjusted, avoiding that particular note for the rest of the piece, redistributing the melody across other keys. The improvisation was so smooth that if you didn't know the original composition, you'd never realize anything had changed. The Rachmaninoff piece built to its dramatic conclusion, and without pausing, Margaret flowed directly into Debussy's Clair de Lune. The shift from the intense darkness of Rachmaninoff to the gentle, moonlit quality of Debussy was like watching a storm transform into a calm night sky. Her touch on the keys softened, became more delicate, more nuanced. This was the piece her mother had loved most. Margaret remembered the first time she'd played it for her parents after learning it at Juilliard. Her mother had cried then too, saying it sounded like a lullaby and a prayer combined. Now playing it again after all these years, Margaret felt like she was having a conversation with ghosts, telling her parents that she was sorry for abandoning the gift they'd sacrificed so much to nurture, that she was sorry it had taken her so long to find her way back to the music. The crowd had swelled. People from other parts of the building had heard the music and come to investigate. Waiters who were supposed to be setting up dinner service stood in the doorway, trays forgotten in their hands. The catering manager, a no-nonsense woman who never allowed disruptions to her schedule, had stopped everything to listen. Even the security guard from the front entrance had wandered in, drawn by sounds he couldn't quite believe were coming from the old broken piano. A distinguished-looking man in his 60s pushed through to the front. His name was Vincent Chen, and he was a renowned concert pianist visiting Millbrook for the weekend to see an old friend. He'd attended the gala reluctantly, expecting a boring evening of small-town charity and mediocre entertainment. What he was hearing now made his blood run cold in the best possible way. He recognized immediately what he was witnessing. This wasn't just someone who could play well. This was someone with genuine, extraordinary talent. Margaret moved into the piece's most famous section, the part everyone recognized even if they didn't know classical music. Her hands moved across the keys like water, gentle but purposeful, creating layers of sound that seemed to shimmer in the air. The damaged piano, which had been written off as useless, was producing something magical under her touch. She opened her eyes for just a moment, and through her tears, she saw the crowd. Dozens of faces all focused on her, all transfixed, and she realized something profound. For 30 years, she'd been invisible. She'd trained herself to move through spaces without being seen, to avoid drawing attention, to make herself small and forgettable. But right now, in this moment, playing this broken piano, she was the most visible person in the room. And it didn't feel terrifying anymore. It felt right. The music carried memories of everything she'd lost and everything she'd survived. Every hardship, every lonely night, every moment of self-doubt and grief poured through her fingers and into the keys. But there was something else in the music, too. There was hope. There was the recognition that even after 30 years of silence, the music hadn't died. It had just been waiting, patient and faithful, for the moment when she'd be ready to let it out again. Vincent Chen stood with his hand over his mouth, shaking his head slowly in disbelief. He'd been performing and teaching for over 40 years. He'd trained dozens of students, some of whom had gone on to successful careers. But he'd rarely seen raw talent like this, especially not from someone playing a damaged instrument in a small-town community center, while dressed in a cleaning woman's simple cotton dress. Margaret brought Clair de Lune to its gentle conclusion, the final notes floating away like leaves on a breeze. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. 3 decades of silence couldn't be satisfied with just 3 pieces. Her hands found the opening chords of Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2, and several people in the crowd actually stepped back in shock. This piece was legendary. It was the kind of composition that separated good pianists from great ones. It demanded incredible technical skill, speed, strength, and endurance. Playing it on a perfect piano in ideal conditions was challenging enough. Playing it on a broken instrument after not performing for 30 years should have been impossible. But Margaret's hands were already racing through the opening section, attacking the keys with a combination of power and precision that made the damaged piano thunder and sing simultaneously. The performance had transcended entertainment. This was something deeper, something that touched people in places they didn't know they had, and as Margaret played on, her face wet with tears but lit up with something that looked like joy, everyone in that room understood they were witnessing something they'd never forget. The Hungarian Rhapsody exploded through the hall like a thunderstorm that had been building for 30 years. Margaret's hands moved with such speed that they seemed to multiply, creating the illusion that 10 people were playing instead of 1. The broken piano shook under the assault, its ancient frame vibrating with the force of the music, but it held together, responding to her touch like it had been waiting its entire existence for this moment. The piece started with dramatic, crashing chords that made several people jump. Margaret's whole body was involved now, leaning into the keys, pulling back, swaying with the rhythm. Her fingers flew up and down the keyboard, hitting notes in rapid succession that created a cascade of sound. The technical difficulty was staggering. Even Vincent Chen, the professional pianist watching from the front row, found himself holding his breath. He'd performed this piece dozens of times in his career, and he knew exactly how challenging it was. What Margaret was doing shouldn't have been possible. The fast section came, the part that always drew gasps from audiences. Margaret's right hand raced through a series of impossibly quick notes, while her left hand thundered out the bass line. She hit one of the stuck keys, and for a split second it seemed like the music would fall apart. But her fingers were already compensating, redistributing the notes to working keys, maintaining the melody without missing a beat. She'd turned the piano's brokenness into part of the performance, making the audience forget there was anything wrong with the instrument at all. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Her arms were starting to ache. 30 years without playing was catching up to her body, but her mind wouldn't let her stop. This wasn't just a performance anymore. This was exorcism, therapy, resurrection, and revenge all rolled into one. Every note she played was a declaration. I'm here. I exist. I matter. You don't get to make me invisible anymore. The young woman, who'd been recording on her phone, had tears streaming down her face. She'd come to this gala because her mother had made her, dragging her away from a Saturday night with friends. She'd been bored and annoyed, scrolling through social media while the adults talked about boring adult things. When Catherine Whitmore had started mocking the cleaning lady, she'd thought it would be funny, something entertaining to break up the monotony. Instead, she'd witnessed something that was changing the way she saw the world. This ordinary-looking woman in a plain dress was producing something extraordinary. If she could hide this much talent, this much depth, what else was she missing when she judged people by their appearances? Doctor. Patterson had pulled out his handkerchief and was wiping his eyes. He'd been coming to this charity gala for 15 years, had sat through countless performances by local musicians and visiting artists. Nothing had ever moved him like this. There was something raw and honest in Margaret's playing that professional performances sometimes lacked. She wasn't playing to impress anyone. She was playing because the music was pouring out of her like water from a broken dam, and she couldn't have stopped it if she'd tried. The piece reached its famous Hungarian dance section, where the rhythm became wild and unpredictable. Margaret's hands flew across the keys, her fingers striking with such precision that every note rang clear despite the piano's damage. She added flourishes that weren't in the original score, improvising around the broken keys, making the performance uniquely hers. This wasn't just Liszt anymore. This was Margaret's story told through Liszt's music, a fusion of classical composition and personal experience. Catherine Whitmore had backed away from the piano, pressing herself against the wall. Her champagne glass had slipped from her fingers at some point and shattered on the floor, but she hadn't even noticed. Her face had gone from pale to flushed, and her hands were shaking. The full weight of what she'd done was crushing down on her. She'd meant to humiliate this woman, to put her in her place, to remind everyone in the room of the social hierarchy that Catherine worked so hard to maintain. Instead, she'd unleashed something magnificent, and in doing so had revealed her own cruelty and pettiness for everyone to see. The women who'd been laughing with Catherine earlier had dispersed into the crowd, trying to distance themselves from the situation. They avoided making eye contact with each other, each one privately horrified at what they'd participated in. The guilt sat heavy in their stomachs, turning the expensive champagne sour. Margaret drove toward the finale, the music building until it felt like the walls themselves were vibrating. Her fingers hammered out the final ascending runs, each note crystal clear, each chord perfectly balanced. The broken piano was singing its heart out, producing sounds that would make the repairman question everything he knew about damaged instruments. And then, with one final triumphant chord that seemed to contain every emotion she'd suppressed for 30 years, Margaret finished. Her hands remained on the keys for a moment, trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. Her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath. Sweat had soaked through the back of her dress. Her fingers ached, her shoulders burned, and her back was screaming in protest. But none of that mattered because for the first time in 3 decades, she felt whole. The silence that followed was absolute. Not a single person moved. Not a single person breathed. The hall was frozen in that perfect moment between the end of the music and the beginning of reaction. Margaret slowly lifted her hands from the keys and placed them in her lap. She opened her eyes and stared down at the piano, at her worn hands resting on her dress, not daring to look at the crowd. Then Dr. Patterson stood up. He brought his hands together once, twice, 3 times. The sound of his applause broke the spell. Suddenly everyone was standing, everyone was clapping, and the noise was deafening. It wasn't polite, obligatory applause. This was the kind of applause that comes from deep in the chest, the kind that makes your hands hurt, the kind that carries the weight of genuine awe and appreciation. People were shouting. Someone yelled, "Bravo!" Others were crying openly, not bothering to wipe away their tears. The waiters were clapping. The catering staff were clapping. The security guard was clapping so hard his hands were probably going to bruise. The applause went on, building in intensity rather than fading. Several people started whistling. Others were stamping their feet. Margaret sat frozen on the bench, overwhelmed by the response. She'd performed for audiences before, back in her Juilliard days, but this felt different. This wasn't a concert hall full of music students and professors who were trained to appreciate technical skill. This was a room full of regular people who'd just watched something transform before their eyes. They weren't just applauding her music. They were applauding her courage, her survival, her refusal to stay invisible. Vincent Chen pushed through the crowd, moving with determination toward the piano. His face was flushed with excitement, his eyes bright. When he reached Margaret, he stood there for a moment, just looking at her, shaking his head in wonder. Then he spoke, his voice cutting through the ongoing applause. "Who are you?" he asked, not rudely but with genuine curiosity and respect. "Where did you study?" Margaret looked up at him, this distinguished man in his expensive suit, and for a moment she couldn't find her voice. The old instinct to make herself small, to deflect attention, rose up in her throat. But something had changed in the last 20 minutes. She'd broken through a wall she'd built around herself, and there was no going back now. "I'm Margaret Sullivan," she said quietly, though her voice was steadier than she expected. "I studied at Juilliard a long time ago." Vincent's eyes widened. "Juilliard? When? Who did you study under?" As Margaret began to share pieces of her story, the applause finally started to fade, replaced by an attentive silence as people leaned in to hear. She told him about her 3 years at the school, about her professors, about the final recital she'd never performed. She told him about her parents' death, about the grief that had silenced her, about the 30 years she'd spent running from her past. More people gathered close, listening to every word. The young woman with the phone was still recording, but now she was documenting something different, not a performance, but a revelation. Vincent listened intently, nodding occasionally, his expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. When Margaret finished speaking, Vincent was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. "I teach at the conservatory in the city," he said, pressing the card into her hand. "We have a performance next month, a benefit concert for music education. I want you to play, not as my student, but as my colleague, as an artist." Margaret stared at the card, her hands shaking again. "I don't think I can. I haven't played in so long, and I don't have a piano to practice on, and I work 6 days a week, and We'll figure it out," Vincent interrupted gently but firmly. "Talent like yours doesn't disappear because of time or circumstances. What you just did, playing like that on a broken piano after 30 years of silence, that's not normal. That's exceptional. You can't waste that. Your parents wouldn't want you to waste that." At the mention of her parents, Margaret's eyes filled with fresh tears. Around them, the crowd was still processing what they'd witnessed. People were talking in hushed, excited tones. Several had their phones out, some still recording, others already posting videos to social media. Within hours, Margaret's performance would be seen by thousands of people. By the next day, millions. But in that moment, standing by the broken piano with Vincent's business card in her hand, and the sound of applause still echoing in her ears, Margaret wasn't thinking about any of that. She was thinking about her mother's smile when she played Clair de Lune. She was thinking about her father standing by the window listening. She was thinking about the girl she'd been at 13, practicing scales until her fingers hurt because she loved music more than anything in the world. That girl was still inside her. She'd been buried, forgotten, written off as lost. But she wasn't gone. She'd been waiting, just like the music, for the right moment to come back to life. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for Margaret. People she'd cleaned houses for, people who'd walked past her in the grocery store without a second glance, suddenly wanted to talk to her. They crowded around asking questions, sharing how the music had made them feel, asking for photographs. It was overwhelming and strange and wonderful all at once. A businessman who owned 3 restaurants in town pulled her aside and offered to sponsor her return to music. "Whatever you need," he said earnestly. "Piano lessons, living expenses while you train. Consider it an investment in the arts." A woman who ran the local arts foundation pressed her card into Margaret's hand, talking rapidly about grants and performance opportunities. Even the mayor himself appeared, all smiles and handshakes, conveniently forgetting that his wife had orchestrated the entire humiliating situation. Speaking of Catherine Whitmore, she disappeared somewhere during the chaos. Margaret caught a glimpse of her near the exit, hurrying toward the parking lot with her head down, her friends nowhere to be seen. Part of Margaret wanted to feel satisfaction at Catherine's embarrassment, but mostly she just felt tired. Holding on to anger took energy she didn't have anymore. The young woman who'd been recording approached Margaret hesitantly. Up close, Margaret could see she was probably 18 or 19, with nervous eyes and guilt written all over her face. "I'm sorry," the girl said quietly. I was recording because I thought it would be funny, you know. I thought... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. She could see herself in this girl, young and thoughtless, not yet understanding how words and actions could wound. It's okay, Margaret said finally. Actually, I'm glad you recorded it. I think I needed proof that it really happened. The girl's eyes lit up. It's already going viral. I posted it 20 minutes ago and it's got like 50,000 views already. People are sharing it everywhere. She showed Margaret her phone screen and sure enough, there was Margaret at the piano, her face intense with concentration, her hands flying across the keys. The caption read, "A cleaning woman told to play a broken piano as a joke. Wait for it." Margaret stared at the video, at this version of herself she barely recognized. The comments were flooding in. This made me cry. Who is she? This is the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. That woman at the beginning should be ashamed of herself. One comment in particular caught her eye. Never judge someone by what they do. You don't know their story. By midnight, when the gala finally ended and the last guests reluctantly left, Margaret sat alone in the empty hall with Vincent. The broken piano stood silent in the corner, having given everything it had. Vincent had stayed behind specifically to talk with her, to make plans to ensure she didn't slip back into invisibility now that the spotlight had found her. You understand this changes everything, right? Vincent said, his tone serious. By tomorrow morning, you'll be famous. Local news will want to interview you. Maybe national news. People are going to want to know your story, and they're going to expect things from you. Margaret nodded slowly. The thought terrified her, but it also stirred something else inside her. Hope, maybe, or purpose. I don't want to be famous, she said honestly. I just want to play music again. Then that's what you'll do, Vincent replied. But on your terms this time. You're not a kid anymore. You're not dependent on other people's approval or money. You've survived 30 years of hardship. You're stronger than you think. Over the next few weeks, Margaret's life transformed in ways she'd never imagined. The video of her performance was viewed over 10 million times. News outlets picked up the story, running features with headlines like, "The Cleaning Lady Who Shocked the World," and "Hidden Genius Discovered at Small Town Gala." Interview requests poured in from morning shows, podcasts, and newspapers, but Margaret was careful about what she accepted. She did a few interviews telling her story in her own words, making sure people understood it wasn't just about talent or skill. It was about loss and grief and finding your way back to yourself after you thought you were lost forever. She talked about her parents, about Juilliard, about the 30 years of silence, and she was honest about the pain, because she knew somewhere out there someone else was hiding their gifts, running from their past, and they needed to know they weren't alone. The offers kept coming. Record labels wanted to sign her. Concert halls wanted to book her. Wealthy patrons offered to fund her career. But Margaret surprised everyone by turning most of it down. She accepted Vincent's invitation to perform at the conservatory benefit concert, and she said yes to a few carefully chosen performances at venues that supported music education. But she didn't want a touring schedule or a recording contract or any of the things that typically came with sudden fame. Instead, she made a different choice. She approached the community center board with a proposal. She'd teach piano lessons free of charge to any child or adult in Millbrook who wanted to learn. The town rallied behind the idea. Donations poured in to renovate one of the unused rooms into a proper music studio. Someone donated a beautiful grand piano. Others contributed keyboards, sheet music, and equipment. Margaret kept her cleaning job, but reduced her hours to 3 days a week. The other 4 days she taught music. Her students ranged from 6-year-olds who could barely reach the pedals to 70-year-olds who'd always wanted to learn but never had the chance. She was patient with all of them, remembering how her own teacher had believed in her when she was just a kid with a dream. The broken piano that had started everything still sat in the community center hall. Margaret refused to let anyone fix it. "It's perfect the way it is," she'd say when people suggested repairs. It taught me that broken things can still make beautiful music. That's a lesson worth remembering. She used that piano for her beginning students, teaching them that perfection wasn't the goal. Connection was. Expression was. Truth was. Some of her students would go on to study music seriously. Others would just play for fun. But all of them would remember the woman who taught them that it's never too late to start, to try, to become who you were meant to be. Catherine Whitmore never apologized publicly. She couldn't face the shame of what she'd done, especially now that the whole world knew about it. She stopped coming to community events, stopped hosting her elaborate parties. Some people said she'd gotten what she deserved. Others felt sorry for her, trapped in her own pride and unable to make amends. Margaret thought about reaching out to her several times but decided against it. Some people needed to find their own way to redemption, and she couldn't do that work for them. 6 months after that fateful evening, Margaret performed at the conservatory benefit concert. The hall was packed with over 1,000 people. Vincent introduced her, telling her story, and when she walked onto the stage, the standing ovation lasted 5 full minutes before she even sat down at the piano. She played Chopin's Nocturne, just like she had that first night, but this time the piano was perfectly tuned. The acoustics were flawless. The setting was everything she'd once dreamed of as a young student. Yet somehow the performance wasn't better than the one she'd given on the broken piano. It was different, more polished perhaps, but not more honest, not more real. After the concert, a young girl approached her nervously. She was maybe 12 with thick glasses and shy eyes. "I saw the video of you playing," the girl said quietly. "My mom says I should quit piano because I'm not good enough, but watching you made me want to keep trying. Is that okay?" Margaret knelt down to the girl's level, taking her small hands in her own work-worn ones. "Sweetheart, it's more than okay. Promise me something. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small. Don't let anyone tell you that you're not good enough. And if you ever lose your way, if life gets hard and you have to put your music down for a while, remember it will always be there waiting for you when you're ready to come back." The girl nodded, tears in her eyes, and hugged Margaret tightly. In that moment, Margaret understood why she'd gone through everything she had. The loss, the grief, the 30 years of silence, the humiliation at the gala, all of it had led to this, to being someone who could tell others that it was possible to survive, to come back, to reclaim the parts of yourself you thought were gone forever. A year after the video went viral, Margaret still lived in her same small apartment in Millbrook. She still knew everyone in town by name. She still shopped at the same grocery store and got her coffee at the same diner. But she was no longer invisible. People saw her now, really saw her, not as a cleaning lady or a viral sensation, but as Margaret, a woman with a story, with talent, with value that had nothing to do with her job or her clothes or her social status. The broken piano remained in the community center hall, a permanent reminder that appearances can be deceiving, that ordinary-looking people can contain extraordinary gifts, that cruelty can sometimes crack open doors we didn't know existed, that it's never too late to become who you were always meant to be. And every Saturday morning, Margaret sat at that broken piano with her students gathered around, teaching them that the most beautiful music doesn't come from perfect instruments or perfect technique. It comes from courage, from vulnerability, from refusing to let the world tell you who you are, from finding your voice even when it's been silent for 30 years and letting it sing.